She swore she'd never tell a soul. Not her staff, not her family, not even under oath. But when the world lost Pope Francis, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett shattered her silence, and what she revealed left Washington speechless. The chamber wasn't just quiet that afternoon. It was holding its breath, as if the air itself had turned to glass, waiting for the woman at the podium to break it. The House chamber had never felt so still. It wasn't the ordinary hush that accompanied legislative debates or roll calls. It was sacred, tense, the kind of silence that settles over a crowd just before something irreversible is said. The echo of Jasmine Crockett's heels had faded minutes ago, yet the air still seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Every member of Congress caught in a collective pause, their attention sharpened like glass. Even the sunlight filtering through the historic windows appeared suspended, unmoving, as if afraid to interrupt what was coming next. At the center of it all stood Jasmine, not the firebrand congresswoman the media loved to dissect, but a woman, alone with the truth. Her hands, clutching the polished wood of the podium, trembled just slightly, not from nerves, but from the sheer magnitude of what she was about to release into the world. She had faced televised interrogations, political hit pieces, and the quiet corrosion of institutional dismissal, but this was different. This wasn't politics. This was testimony. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice slow and even, yet pulsing with emotion. "I'm not here today as a Democrat, nor as a representative of my district. I stand before you as a witness." That word, witness, hung in the air, shifting the energy of the room. Members leaned forward. Phones were lowered. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to zoom in with intention. What no one in that chamber knew, not her colleagues, not her staff, not even her closest friends, was that Jasmine had spent the last 2 years carrying something sacred and unbearable. A conversation that had redefined her very soul. It wasn't policy that had changed her. It wasn't outrage. It was a moment of human truth delivered in the most unexpected place by the most unexpected man, the Pope himself. And now, with Pope Francis gone and the world drowning in speculation and sorrow, she could no longer stay silent. Something inside her had shifted with the news. The dam had cracked. She looked around the room, her eyes locking with both allies and skeptics. "Before today," she said, her voice growing firmer, "I had no intention of speaking this aloud. But when the world loses someone who carried so much truth, silence becomes betrayal." 2 years earlier, Jasmine had flown to Rome expecting little more than a tightly scheduled diplomatic circus, smiling photo ops, rehearsed lines about transatlantic cooperation, and a carefully curated tour of the Vatican that would leave her with nothing but a new profile picture and aching feet. She'd almost skipped it entirely, frustrated by another round of domestic legislative losses and exhausted from being treated as that loud progressive from Texas by colleagues who could barely remember her name. But something, some tug, she couldn't explain, had told her to go. She remembered the exact moment it changed. It was just after the press tour had finished. The marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace buzzed with diplomatic chatter, the kind Jasmine had mastered, pretending to care about. Then a man in a plain gray suit with a Vatican crest just barely visible on his lapel appeared at her side like a ghost. "His Holiness requests a moment," he said, softly, urgently. His voice didn't sound ceremonial. It sounded secretive, like the kind of request you didn't deny. The others were ushered along without her, oblivious. She followed the man, through a maze of narrowing hallways that grew quieter with each step, the ornate grandeur of the Vatican beginning to feel more like a cathedral of shadows. Finally, they stopped before a plain wooden door. No gold trim, no guards, just a doorknob. And a silence so thick she could feel it in her teeth. He opened the door. The room was almost barren. No Baroque paintings, no papal regalia. Just 2 wooden chairs, a small table with a glass pitcher of water, and a single arched window overlooking the Vatican gardens, where the hedges moved gently in the wind like bowing heads. And then she saw him. Pope Francis. He didn't rise. He didn't gesture grandly. He simply looked up at her with eyes so sharp, so unflinching, that she stopped mid-step. There was no entourage, no translator. Just him. "Congresswoman," he said, his accent soft, his tone flat. "Do you know why you're here?" She didn't. And the way he asked made her feel as if she should. He motioned to the chair across from him. She sat, her throat dry, her palms slick. The silence stretched. Then, without any preamble, he began to speak, not as a priest, not as a diplomat, but as a man who had seen too much. He spoke of death, not as tragedy, but as routine, of refugee camps where children disappeared between sunrise and supper, of churches turned into war zones, of how prayer sometimes felt like pretending. He spoke of America, her home, with a clarity that made her uncomfortable. How policies were written not for the people, but for the preservation of power. How faith was weaponized as often as it was honored. How justice, in some corners of the world, had become a bedtime story whispered to keep people obedient. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She couldn't. She felt like a sponge, soaking in something. Ancient, sacred, and terrifying. "You think your fight is about policy," he said finally, leaning in so close she could see the deep fatigue in his eyes. "But it's about fear. The powerful aren't afraid of your rage. They're afraid of your persistence." He paused, then added softly, "Promise me you won't let them make you small." It was not a blessing. It was not even a command. It was a plea, and though she said nothing aloud that day, her heart answered. Jasmine returned to Washington with her usual fire, but something fundamental had shifted. Her colleagues didn't notice at first. To them, she was the same Congresswoman Crockett, fiery in debates, uncompromising in her principles, and relentlessly vocal about systemic injustice. But beneath the surface, beneath the polished speeches and committee hearings, she carried something they couldn't see. A private ember lit by a dying pope's words, burning slowly in the quiet corners of her soul. She didn't tell anyone. Not her chief of staff, not the friends who drank wine with her after long sessions, not even her pastor. The memory of that meeting lived in silence, tucked between her ribs like a blade she didn't dare unsheath. Every time she watched a vote fail, on housing reform, on police accountability, on healthcare equity, she felt the Pope's voice echo in her bones. Don't let them make you small. But Washington was built to make people small. Her housing bill was gutted in committee, stripped of its spine by moderates who feared its ambition. When she stood to defend it, the room barely looked up. TV pundits labeled her emotional, naive, theatrical. One op-ed said she had passion, but no plan, as if justice were a spreadsheet. She wanted to scream, to drag every last one of them into the Vatican garden and force them to sit where she had sat, to hear what she had heard. But instead, she swallowed it, again and again, because the Pope hadn't told her to speak. He'd told her to persist. She began working differently, quietly, strategically. She met with organizers late at night, away from cameras. She rewrote bills in plain language and walked them into housing projects herself. She used committee, time to read names, of the unhoused, the evicted, the forgotten, knowing the press wouldn't cover it, but hoping someone would hear. Still, there were nights she questioned everything. Nights when the Capitol dome looked less like a symbol and more like a cage. When exhaustion curled in her gut like smoke. When compromise felt like betrayal and silence like surrender. On those nights, she'd play back that meeting in her mind. The Pope's eyes, not soft but searing, as if he'd seen the end of something and decided to whisper its warning only to her. And through all of it, she didn't tell a soul. Not even when her staff begged her to tone it down, to stop alienating donors, to think long-term. Not even when she lost committee influence, Not even when colleagues she once called allies turned cold. She carried the truth like armor, and sometimes like a weight. But she carried it. They called it a diplomatic mission, a photo op, a goodwill tour. But for Jasmine Crockett, that trip to Rome 2 years ago had never been just another line on her congressional resume. From the moment she stepped onto Vatican grounds, something had felt off. Not ominous, but weighty, like she was walking into a room where the air had already decided not to leave. The halls of the Apostolic Palace were as grand as expected. Ceilings, painted like the sky before God spoke light into existence. Marble floors that whispered centuries of footsteps beneath each stride. Jasmine had toured historic buildings before. Capitol Hill had its own ghost stories. But this was different. Here, even the quiet had its own theology. She was supposed to shake hands with cardinals, pose in front of tapestries, nod through carefully, rehearsed conversations about unity and diplomacy. But instead, after just 10 minutes into the visit, a man in a gray suit, anonymous, almost featureless, appeared at her side. His voice was barely audible, like he didn't want the frescoes to overhear. His Holiness requests a moment. Jasmine had blinked, just once, then followed. The walk felt longer than it was. Through halls increasingly stripped of opulence, into a narrow corridor with walls that bore no gold, no paintings, no pride. The room at the end was nearly barren. 2 wooden chairs, a small desk, and a window overlooking the papal gardens. There were no guards, no assistants, only him. Pope Francis sat quietly, his back curved not with weakness but with the weight of empathy. His cassock seemed more like a worker's robe in that light. Jasmine expected formalities. She reached for the standard script. But he raised his hand, barely, and the silence that followed shattered every assumption. "Congresswoman," he said, not as an address, but as a mirror. She froze. "Yes, Your Holiness? Do you know why you're here?" The question landed like a thunderclap in her chest. She didn't, and he could tell. He leaned forward, eyes sharp and unrelenting. "Because not all truths survive in vaults. Some must be passed like fire, hand to hand, until they find the one willing to carry them into the dark." Then came the stories, not from headlines, but from the fault lines of the world. Women raped in war zones while the international community debated definitions. Children used as currency. Executions carried out in fields, not because of religion or race, but because someone needed a message sent. He didn't speak like a pope. He spoke like a man drowning in the weight of knowing too much. "You think you're fighting for housing or health care," he said softly. "But what you're really fighting is the idea that some lives are disposable." Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. She just listened, knowing that something irreversible was happening in that room. He stood, slowly, like gravity was. A decision. "Promise me," he said. "Promise me you'll never let them make you smaller than your truth. Because when this world burns, it won't be from fire. It'll be from forgetting." And then, he placed something in her hand. A simple medallion. Bronze. Unadorned. On its back, a single word. Resistere. To resist. She'd worn it every day since. Now, standing in front of the house chamber, about to open the vault of that moment, Jasmine realized she hadn't been chosen because of power. She'd been chosen because she wouldn't flinch when it mattered. The moment Jasmine stepped away from the podium, the room didn't erupt. It didn't even move. That was the first sign something had shifted. The house chamber, normally a chaotic symphony of paper shuffling, murmured rebuttals and performative eye rolls, had turned into something else entirely. A sanctuary. One built not of bricks or pews, but of stunned silence. Reporters blinked. Staffers froze mid-gesture. Representatives who hadn't looked up from their phones in months suddenly found their screens forgotten on their laps. Even the speaker, whose gavel usually punctuated the end of speeches like a sigh of relief, simply sat there, mouth slightly open, eyes tracking Jasmine like she'd just spoken in a language older than Latin. But the silence didn't last long. The first tweet came before Jasmine even reached the chamber doors. A journalist from a minor D.C. political blog had managed to tap out "Breaking." Reporter Jasmine Crockett just revealed she had a private audience with Pope Francis. Her speech? Chilling, courageous. History might remember today. Within minutes, it had 10,000 retweets. And that was only the beginning. By the time Jasmine returned to her office, CNN was already running a chyron. Pope's secret meeting with US Congresswoman. Why now? MSNBC called it the Sermon on the Hill. Fox News asked, was Crockett coached by the Vatican to influence American politics? Her staff looked at her like she was radioactive. Are we okay? Her chief of staff asked, voice hushed like they were in a church instead of a building with bulletproof glass. Jasmine didn't answer. Not yet. She was still trying to catch her breath. Not because of the backlash she knew was coming, but because, for the first time in 2 years, she felt lighter. Like speaking the truth hadn't weighed her down, but lifted something off. And then came the messages, emails, texts, DMs, hundreds, thousands. Some were furious, accusing her of politicizing religion, of fabricating the story, of manipulating grief for attention. But most weren't like that. Most came from the shadows, a nurse in Detroit who'd seen too many patients die waiting for care. A teacher in Kentucky whose school was still using textbooks from 1994, a formerly incarcerated father in Louisiana, who'd missed his daughter's graduation because his parole officer didn't trust the traffic. Each message had a different face, a different wound, but all of them shared the same undercurrent. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. That night, Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, the city buzzing outside her window like a hive set on fire. She stared at the bronze medallion on her desk. Resistere. Resist. She picked it up, thumbed the edges, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not out of sadness, but because she knew the ripple had started. And no one, not the critics, not the cynics, not even Congress, could stop the wave that was coming. By sunrise, the knives were out. The political machine doesn't sleep. Especially not when it smells blood. And Jasmine Crockett, once dismissed as a progressive footnote, had become the headline that every strategist in Washington scrambled to frame. To some, she was Joan of Arc in a pantsuit. To others, a reckless zealot, with a martyr complex. But to all, she was now impossible to ignore. The backlash wasn't subtle. It came in waves, strategic, deliberate, and brutal. The first shot was fired by a senior member of her own party during a morning interview. "We appreciate Representative Crockett's passion," he said, voice dipped in paternal condescension. "But this is not the time for conspiracy theories or religious mysticism. We're lawmakers, not prophets." Cable networks ate it up. Commentators painted her confession as either the delusions of a grief-stricken idealist or a clever political stunt designed to manipulate Pope Francis's death for votes. Conservative think tanks published op-eds questioning the credibility of a private papal audience with no witnesses. Talk radio hosts labeled her the Vatican plant. Memes exploded across social media, half mockery, half reverence. But the most devastating blow came that afternoon, when a confidential ethics inquiry was leaked to the press. An anonymous source had raised concerns about unreported foreign interactions during her trip to Rome. Suddenly, what had been a spiritual revelation was rebranded as a potential violation of congressional conduct. The House Ethics Committee announced a preliminary investigation. Her name was dragged into headlines alongside words like probe, national security, and undisclosed influence. Inside her office, phones rang non-stop. Journalists circled like vultures. Staffers whispered in corners. A few aides requested temporary reassignments. Only her chief of staff stayed rooted. "They're trying to bury it," he said quietly, laying a folder on her desk. Your story, his words, everything. They don't care if it's true, they care that it's disruptive. Jasmine didn't flinch. She knew this was coming. Power doesn't yield easily. And those who dared to challenge its rituals, especially using the voice of a dead pope, weren't met with applause. They were crucified. But what the machine hadn't counted on was the people. Outside her D.C. office, a candlelight vigil had started. Just a few at first, college students, activists, clergy members. But by dusk, the street was full. Signs read, "We believe her. Truth isn't treason." The Pope knew. One elderly woman held a handwritten note above her head. It said, "Tell them, he spoke to us too." Jasmine watched from her window, heart pounding, not with fear but with clarity. The storm had come, but so had the movement. And now she understood what the Pope meant when he whispered, "Don't let them make you small." They could investigate her. They could slander her. But they couldn't unring the bell. It was always going to come down to this moment. The reckoning. The storm that had been swirling around Jasmine Crockett for weeks finally came to a head during a late-night vote on Capitol Hill. The halls were quiet, the kind of stillness that only the dead of night could bring. But inside the House chamber, the air felt charged, alive with the electricity of expectation. The cameras were rolling, but no one was focused on the issue at hand. The real drama wasn't the vote. It was the woman standing at the podium once more, holding the weight of her truth. Her speech was ready. Her words had been carefully crafted. But even as the moment arrived, Jasmine knew that what she was about to say could change everything. She had been invited to testify before the committee investigating the leak about her alleged foreign interactions. To some, this was a victory, a chance to clear her name. To others, it was the final battle in a war they had long anticipated. For Jasmine, it was the opportunity to reclaim the narrative that had been hijacked, to stand tall in front of those who had tried to diminish her. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice steady but fierce, "I'm not here to defend my actions. I'm here to defend my humanity." There was a collective intake of breath. The room seemed to lean forward, sensing that something big was about to happen. She continued, her words a laser focus on the heart of the matter, the truth. "For 2 years, I've carried a burden that no one should have to bear. I was told not to speak. I was told to keep my head down. But when the Pope, Pope Francis, shared his truth with me, I made a promise. And I refuse to let fear or politics or any of you take that from me." As she spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the glare of the lights becoming almost unbearable. The committee members shifted in their seats, unsure whether to remain neutral or to challenge her. But Jasmine didn't pause. "You want to know what happened in Rome?" she asked, her voice rising with righteous fury. "I was given a message about persistence, about standing firm in the face of corruption, of injustice. I was told, don't let them make you small." She took a breath, her chest rising with the weight of her words. "And I'm here now, telling you, I'm not small. I won't be small." The room was still, silent. But outside, the world had erupted. News outlets covered every angle. Some praised her for her courage. Others painted her as a political opportunist. But in the days that followed, the same question echoed across the country. What happens when someone refuses to be silenced? For Jasmine, the answer was clear. She wasn't just fighting for a seat in Congress. She was fighting for something far larger. The future, the truth, and the promise that when the powerful silence the voices of the marginalized, there will always be someone willing to speak. And just like that, the narrative had shifted. The battle was far from over. Jasmine Crockett knew the road ahead would be long, but she had learned something powerful in the process. Sometimes, the only way to break the silence is to speak your truth, no matter the cost. Now, here's the question for you. Have you ever been faced with a truth so heavy it forced you to make a choice? To speak or to remain silent? And if you spoke, what did you learn? Drop your thoughts below, and let's continue the conversation.